a lot, all the participants, for taking time out on a Sunday afternoon, which I can imagine has so many other, attractions. But I'm glad that you make time out to, hear me out today. I also believe that this whole workshop, which has been organized by IIT Tirupati, is something which will be extremely useful for academics all across. So, capacity building through research and academic writing, I think that is something which we all are expected to do. And there are so many times that the nuances of it escape us, right? So, also, the other very important aspect that one needs to keep in mind that we're all non-native speakers of English. The language does not happen to be our mother tongue, any of us here, I would assume. And we learn it as we grow up, probably in school, through profession, through training, and so on. So there are smaller and larger errors that keep cropping up, especially for non-native speakers. And that's something which I will also be addressing in my talk today. Okay, but first I would want to address something which is actually very core in the whole discourse of the academia, which is writing to publish, which is what the title of my talk today is. So I'll just share the screen, and please let me know when it's visible.
Your talk is on a crucial issue, ma'am. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
I am so glad.
It's going to help all the participants.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dwivedi. I'm also hoping that, I managed to address some of the key issues which are very integral to the whole business of publication, right? And
yes,
what we also know is, in the Western world, the old adage as it goes now in the academia that you publish or you perish, right? Which is increasingly becoming true for our worlds as well. I mean, increasingly with globalization, people are understanding the pressures to publish, right? And to publish in the good places, in the right places. Yeah. So I will actually also be touching upon this rather critical issue of what is considered a good publication as well, right? And while it may, I'm also looking forward to your responses to this. By the end of the talk, if there's something you'd want to even present right in the middle as a question, you're most welcome to do so. Okay, so without further ado, I will start. Once I put my PPT on, I will probably not be able to see the screen. So I request if anybody wants me to stop, or if there's a question or something, do speak up, so that I know that there is perhaps a question. Okay, so I'm putting it in the presentation mode. Dr. Dwivedi, please tell me when it's visible.
Okay? Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's right? Visible now. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think I have talked about the, the topic of my presentation. And I think as Dr. Dwivedi introduced, I come from a literary background. Okay, so I will not go entirely the literary way, and yet, dealing with language and words is what our vocation is. So I'll just start with a short imagery and a long quote. That's what it is from a poet and a critical writer of the American letters. His name is Kenneth Burke, very popular during the 20th century. And this is a quote which has also been used by some of the greatest writers of, composition and academic writing, and which is why I want to share it with you. Okay, so do walk with me through this quote, because I think it will show you what exactly perhaps is expected of us when we try to engage in academic writing. Okay, so Burke himself was, he wrote a lot of books. He was a poet, but also a critical writer. He wrote a lot of critical and creative work together. Okay, and this is what Burke tells us about writing. Okay, and let's begin then. I'll read the whole thing with you. Yeah. Imagine that you enter a parlor. Now, Burke is drawing for us an imagery, okay? And like I said, let's walk through this imagery together. Imagine that you enter a parlor, you come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in a heated discussion, a discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it is about. Now, the image that Burke is drawing up for us is this beautiful parlor. It's it's booming with people's voices. Everybody is busy in a heated discussion. Okay. And nobody wants to stop and tell you what they are talking about. But you have entered this parlor and you are late. Now, at the end of this quote, we will see what exactly Burke is telling us. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there, so that no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone before. So this discussion in this parlor is a long-standing one. It had been there for a very long time, right? And nobody has the time to actually go back and tell you what exactly has been said or everything that has been said. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of the argument. So, like a quiet, patient, person inside the room, right? You sit back and you listen to what has gone on patiently till you catch what is going on. Then you put in your oar. That is, then you start to put in your own endeavors into the whole project. Someone answers, you answer him. Another comes to your defense. Another aligns himself against you, to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending upon the quality of your ally's assistance. However, the discussion is interminable. The discussion will not stop. It will go on. Whether you argue, whether you agree, right? Whether you agree and disagree, this discussion shall not stop. The hour grows late, you must depart. And you do depart with the discussion still vigorously in progress. Okay, close quotes. Now, Burke, by presenting to us this parlor, is actually also telling us about the whole academic world, right? Whichever discipline you come from, whether it's the engineering, the sciences, the social sciences, or the humanities, your parlor, your room of discussion has existed long before you came, right? You probably entered it quite late, and there was already enough research, enough data which was already there, right? You come in and nobody will tell you exactly what all has been discussed. Okay, nobody will retrace every step for you. That is a job that a researcher has to do himself or herself, right? So you listen for a while, that is, you train yourself in the research, and then you put in your own, then you put forth your own research, right? Someone answers, someone sees your research and says it's not good enough. Probably when we are doing our doctoral studies, our advisors would tell us, our peer would tell us, right? As we keep moving through time, more and more questions and answers come our way. We present our work in writing, probably to journals. They get rejected or accepted. They agree with us, they don't agree, right? Depending on the quality of what we present. And yet, the discussion that we have, whether it's a technical discourse, a humanities discourse, anything, it's interminable. It won't stop, whatever you do, right? The hour grows late. It's a metaphor for both life and for your academic career, right? As the hour grows late, people have to leave the room. The world, if entering the parlor was being born, right? If entering the parlor was entering your academic career, then even then the hour grows late when you retire, right? And you must depart, you have to leave, and you do depart. But when you leave, the discussion will continue and continue vigorously for God knows how much time to come, probably infinity, which is not in human control, right? So what I'm trying to do by, just talking about this very basic thing, if I may, uh, the whole idea of entering into an academic discourse, okay, is not simply saying that, okay, I have come up with a very novel idea, okay, and I can go ahead and present it, I can go ahead and publish it, I can go ahead and talk about it. We are all entering our little parlors in our little chosen domains, right? And there, it depends on how much we have heard the existing conversations, right? So, literature review. This existing conversation is probably that. The amount of archival research you do, the amount of ethnographic research you do, the amount of technical, rigorous lab work you do, your data, the collection of the existing discussion, right? And then when you start off, that is where your own work comes into play. Okay, so this is, I think, a very powerful quote that almost like 80 years ago, Burke gave us, and it lives even today. I mean, this is at the heart of any kind of research activity that we need to do. It's not that sometimes when we start research, there's a lot of confidence and a lot of pride in what we have, right? But it's increasingly important to understand that there is so much body of existing literature that needs to be, brought into discussion before we depart, before we have given in our bid. Okay. There are several techniques to it. Now, this imagery, as abstract as it is, takes me further to the various sorts of techniques that probably, academics across the world have suggested, people who deal with research have suggested how to go about, putting your oar, bringing out the best of the topics that you have at hand, right? And to publish for the academia, which is, again, not any typical publication. It's very rigorous, very formal, very conventional, rule bound, defined by a number of set of laws and norms, right? So I think it's one of the best ways for, personally, I feel as a literature scholar, that this is one of the best ways to, start with literary research, or any kind of research for that matter. Okay, so with this little background, I will not dwell too much upon literary discourses, but try to make it a more generic discussion, because I believe the participants are from all kinds of backgrounds. So I'm assuming that, this background would help, of course. So I am drawing a couple of concepts from, and this is a professor in Princeton, Wendy Belcher. Okay, her book, which was written in 2009, Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks, A Guide to Academic Publishing Success. Okay, now Belcher is one of those creative writers, but also educationists and researchers who has produced this very marvelous, useful book. And I'll give you the reading list. I'll share it with Professor Dwivedi after the talk. This book, I found some of the key concepts, and I'm going to paraphrase quickly because it's quite a massive book, but I would be drawing some of the concepts from here, and I'm sure that you would find them as useful as I do. Okay. So Belcher has very clearly told us a lot about what publication entails, right? Let me begin very quickly with types of academic articles. I'm assuming that, all the participants here would perhaps be aware of these, right? And yet I would want to reiterate what each type of academic article means, right? What is its role? What are the purposes, right? What kind of channels do academic articles move from, right? So these are some of the things that, I would want to sort of point out here. So Belcher gives us these very basic major broad lines of what types of academic articles are like. One of the simplest forms would be the annotated bibliography, right? So this is a bibliographic entry, but with a couple of lines about each book, right? So you would find this is not usually considered a journal publication, right? Some journals at times, for example, in English, the PMLA, right, or some other reputed journals would, have a list of annotated bibliography in a specific field, in a special issue, perhaps, right? Sometimes published books will be there which have annotated bibliography. Okay. However, if you have published an annotated bibliography anywhere, it would ideally not be counted. Now, what do I mean by being counted? We are all aware now that, UGC has mandated X number of publications, right? For you to find a job and to grow in your career, right? So the more, the merrier, perhaps. They have a number of lists and index journals which you're expected to publish in. Likewise, the IITs have their own set of norms, right? IISCs have, and that's the Indian scenario. The central universities have their own norms of publishing and promotions and growth in career based on that. In the Western world, the whole publication business used to be, we are increasingly moving towards that model, has been extremely stringent, right? They have a certain, a bar which has to be reached. And I'm sure most of you would be aware of that. So one reaches it or perishes. So what I began with, the whole discourse of the publish and perish, as it were. In that scenario, an annotated bibliography would not be counted. Now, what does counted mean? It would not be seen as a worthy enough piece of publication. It could be added to your CV, but it would not be viewed as something which is very, very substantial as a contribution. Okay. Book reviews. This is also very often written by a lot of scholars, by a lot of academics, right? But they are often read by graduate students. By graduate, I mean doctoral and postdoctoral students, probably. Uh, Mostly they would be read to find out what is there in a given book. It's a part of their research, so they need to find out what's there in a given book. But they are also read by specialists, right? Sometimes people who are specialists in a field may want to read what's there in a book review. They are also often not counted. Again, not seen as something very rigorous, not seen as something as a major academic contribution, as a major academic publication. Trade and professional article. Now, usually these are non-academic. A lot of academics also write in popular newspapers, magazines, right? They form popular writing. There are now a number of official blogs also where people publish, okay? Be that as it may, the fact that trade and professional articles also do not get categorized as academic publications. Okay, so these are some of the things that need to be kept in mind. While academics very often engage in these sort of publications, they are increasingly not counted as something which is substantial. Notes, this is, we are slowly moving in, increasing in rigor, right? So notes would usually be shorter discussions. In some places they would be up to even 500 words. In most places they would be up to 3000 words, but not more. Okay, so there would be a short discussion on academic findings, but they will not be a fully developed, fully grown research paper. And it again is not counted usually as a major research contribution. So if we have a CV which has, 5 notes and just perhaps one proper research article, it may lose in weight compared to a CV which has 2 research articles, right? So these are sort of understood, they are sort of self-explanatory ideas, and yet I would want to enumerate them because Belcher also tells us that very often we miss out on these things. Even if they come out in very highly reputed presses, we assume that such notes or such book reviews add a lot to the CV, but their weightage of course is low. Interviews, now this is again another form of academic writing which people do. It is a focused introduction or a reference for works of other scholars, scientists, political figures. Okay, they are important to define questions of relevance. Okay, so sometimes interviews are good places for a researcher to start with. Okay, you have to, if you are the person who's taking the interview, you must define research questions of relevance for the person you're interviewing. It is only then that an interview can get published in a reputed journal, right? And of course, then there is a painstaking process of transcribing, because from speech, which is usually recorded, to transcribing it into academic language in itself is a rigorous task, right? So this is also considered to be one of the important publication related endeavors, and yet it may not be seen as as highly recommended or reputed as perhaps a research article. Okay, translation, this is also again does not much count, but of some scholarly relevance, and that goes without saying. I guess that's self-explanatory. Then we come to what is seen as really rigorous research work. Okay, uh, slowly we are moving towards it. So response article is usually when somebody writes, and these are usually shorter again than a proper research article. Response article would be in response to a previously published work. Suppose you as a researcher don't think that a particular work is has filled a certain gap, you may want to simply add to it, right? Or you want to carry forward an existing piece of research, you may write a response work. Sometimes people write it in response to their own articles also, right? If they have found a rebuttal or if they want to add to what they've already said. So this is usually in terms of a response. Finally, again, moving towards what exactly would be considered core academic articles, it starts with a review article, right? Mostly it would be a summary of existing literature, but it's not simply descriptive. It has to have the critical bent where you see what gaps and possible future directions can be added. Okay, so that is mostly, and it's more of a social sciences and technology and sciences kind of an article where you have more of review articles. The humanities don't deal too much with that. Okay. Theoretical article. Now, this is the core of academic publication, right? Advances the theory in a given field, very rigorous, academically strongly oriented, right? Social science research article, right? So, for those of you who are perhaps engaging in the social sciences research, this is as obvious as the sky is blue, right? You have three kinds. The qualitative, where you are data driven, there's a lot of empirical work which is used. Qualitative is more of ethnographic. I'm sorry, I confused it with quantitative. Qualitative is where you use a lot of ethnographic research, right? A lot of analysis, theory based, some data. Quantitative would be the empirical one, where you use a lot of data and there is an analysis and there's a certain methodology. Interpretive is slightly softer, it's more theoretical. Okay, so it's a mix and match of both. Also, there's a lot of ethnographic bit involved in the interpretive research, right? Humanities research articles, they are usually having an original analysis, mostly on a piece of a narrative, right? So very often the original research would depend on the line, say if it's a history paper or a philosophy paper or a literature paper, depending on the chosen discourse, there has to be an analysis of a given topic. The approach usually is of particular, the phenomenological approach over the more positivist or the generic approach, right? It's not so much data driven as it is more concept and theory driven, largely. And of course, the natural science research article. So this would definitely be driven by empirical facts and data, right? And they are often co-authored. So you have quite a few quite a few writers who together engage in bringing out the typical natural science research articles. Now, all the last four theoretical articles are what are considered to be they are the ones that are counted for giving jobs, counted for promotions, and these prove to be the most important contributions to any given field of research. Okay. Now, having outlined these, I just want to, take a short moment to tell you that my presentation today is divided into three parts. The first, where I draw upon quite a bit on the kinds of research that is expected out of academic professionals, right? Which will have the types of research articles, academic articles, and so on. What goes into them, okay? What is expected of them? What makes an article successful and what makes it unsuccessful? These are the kind of things I'll talk about. The second part of my research again draws upon some of the most eminent educationists and researchers across the world who have talked about the whole process of academic writing. Okay, so I have defined for you a few templates, which I'm assuming will be useful. So that would be the second part of my presentation. And finally, of course, I will be actually talking about the nitty-gritties of writing. Okay. What I would mean by the nitty-gritties of writing is that as non-native speakers, there are a lot of communication flaws that naturally come our way. Okay, so I would want to actually point out those possible flaws. A lot of them would be grammatical. The attempt here is not to take a class on grammar, not at all. The attempt here is perhaps to point out the possible places where even advanced scholars, fairly mature researchers also tend to falter. Okay, so these are the basic three parts that my presentation today is divided into, and the first part is more generic, and from there I'll keep moving towards the particular. Okay, if there are any questions or comments in the middle, please, like I said, do speak up. Are there any at the moment?
Ma'am, how do you rate those peer-reviewed journals?
How do I rate peer-reviewed journals?
Yes.
Which journal again? I mean, journals have a certain ranking, right? So which peer-reviewed? Because most journals claim to be peer-reviewed. So perhaps you would require to be a little more specific.
No, nowadays we have so many peer-reviewed interdisciplinary journals. What is the standing of these journals? I needed to know.
See, there are a couple of databases today which are used for filtering out quality of journals. Okay. So, for example, the Thomson Reuters index, if you just put in names of a journal and you find it there, you can be rather sure that it's a globally acclaimed peer reviewed journal. Almost all journals claim to be peer reviewed, and yet some actually even come out from people's local garages, unfortunately, even today. And some actually come out with the rigor of world class research, right? So perhaps you might want to look up a journal if it appears in the Scopus database, right? The Elsevier Scopus database, perhaps the Thomson Reuters database, right? When you go to repositories such as EBSCOhost or Gestor, you might find names of journals which are there. So these are some of the foolproof methods of finding out whether a journal has a global repute, right? I'm not saying that every journal put in there would be absolutely great, and yet they would have undergone some sort of a scrutiny or analysis. Okay, so if we are looking at a globalized world where research also needs to be of a certain standard or has a certain bar, then perhaps these global databases are placed to check whether a particular peer-reviewed journal is of repute or not. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Right. So I'll move on then. And I just want to bust a couple of myths, which again, I'm drawing upon what, Belcher tells us. And these are very interesting myths that she sort of, breaks for us in terms of, the academic writing business and so on. What gets published, right? And there are these general notions which you might hear in the academic corridors, that only heavily theoretical articles with grand results and outcomes get published. Myth. It's not necessary that only grand results get published. Some very narrow but very pertinent results can always be published. Only those articles with catchy concepts or interesting concepts get published. There is nothing as a catchy concept. In this world, everything is worth academic attention if you look at it with an academic critical lens, right? From whichever discipline you come, right? Research is something which does not have an end to it. You could really focus on any possible concept, right? It's how you present, it's how much rigor that has gone into presenting the whole idea. That is what makes a publication worthy article. So it's not the catchiness or the hotness of a topic, as it were, but it's more about its relevance, its rigor, and its significance in the present day world. Only entirely novel or original articles get published. Remember the Burkean parlor. There is nothing as novel or original in its entirety. Even if you're developing a drug today, in the medicinal lines. Now, that is far from my specialization, but this much I know, that some of the compounds, some of the molecules have been there. It's based on those that newer molecules get developed. You reject some, you take up some, right? The discussion in the Burkean parlor has been there long before you and will be there long after you. By you, I mean the generic world, right? The world of researchers. So there is nothing which is entirely novel or original, right? It's how you present a certain concept. It's how you develop on literature and you create a newness from that existing literature. And how relevant it comes out to be is what gets published, right? So these are the myths that require busting. Instead, what gets published does the following: approaches new evidence in an old way. Now, I'm quoting directly from Belcher herself. So it approaches new evidence, the new data that you collect, whether it's ethnographic, whether it's an interpretation of a text, whether it's technical data. You approach it with increasing new insights because the world is moving in a linear fashion. There is more and more data that's coming your way, whether it's a technical analysis or a literary one. The fact that there are always newer approaches, right? So when you approach evidence in the old way, but the evidence is new, right? That is something that is publication worthy. Approaches old evidence in a new way. So there is already an existing data, but now you have a new way of interpreting it. That is another way of moving ahead. Pairs old evidence with old approaches in a new way, right? So these, again, I would suggest that depending on your specific discipline, this would make a lot of sense. right? So for example, if I had to take a very typically literary example here, because I come from that background, for example, a Shakespearean sonnet, it's old text. The old approach, reading it through its meter, its rhyme, its internal structure, right? And in a new way, contextualizing it from the perspective of 2021. How would you want to even look at a particular piece of, literary work which is 500 years old, right? Pairing old evidence with old approaches in a new way, right? So, and the same would hold good for almost all disciplines that perhaps each of you come from, right? So Belcher tells us that these are some of the things that people need to keep in mind rather than always aiming for the masterpiece, the grand result, right? The most original article. There is no such thing. You always have to engage with that Burkean parlor, existing discussion vis-a-vis your own research, right? Writing a journal article, these are some of the very basic ways of starting with it. So do a thorough research on the journal that you choose for submitting your work. Okay, so I think the question that just came up, how do you realize that an article, a journal is worth submitting to? Like I said, check up its reputation. That is one of the best things one can do, right? So checking the reputation through some of the globally acknowledged database today, with so much information on our palm tops, with our cell phones giving us these databases right away, you have ample scope to actually rigorously find out what are the respected journals in which field, right? So do a thorough research on the journal you want to submit your work to. Read model articles, perhaps download a couple of them, get hold of a couple of them through library repositories or whatever you can. Read a couple of model articles very carefully. Follow your model article to the T. Just see what kind of a tenor, language requirement it has, what is the tone, what is the amount of data, what is the amount of analysis, what is its approach. These are things that you will need to keep in mind. Write a good abstract, because that's one of the beginning or the key features that your readers, your editors, your reviewers will be looking at. So the abstract, and Belcher's book actually has a long passage on how writing a good abstract is or how it is done. The reading list I will pass on to you after my talk, I'm assuming should give you a good inroads into how to look at writing good abstracts. So you need to be very focused upfront with your idea, no going roundabout and going in circles or convoluted, but a very, very candid, forthright presentation of what you want to talk about, what your article talks about, what conversations it brings out. So those are things that would be integral to a good abstract, right? Stick to the word limit, stick to the very core argument. Okay. Define your timeline and task, make meticulous and copious notes. So once you are done with all of this, define how much time you would take. Very often it's important because an article can lie with a writer or a researcher for a year, but there are times when you can actually wind it up in 2 to 3 months also. If it's a really long, rigorous article. For some who already have some background work done, it can take even lesser time, right? So define your timeline and task. Do not let it stay with you for a long time. That leads to writer's block, right? And make a lot of notes, amass all your data as you're beginning to write. Edit and revise compulsively. So even when and this is again a part of the presentation that I will be bringing to you. Why is it so important to revise compulsively? Why is it so important to be a readerly writer? Why must you think from the perspective of your reader and not your own perspective alone, right? So that's something that you would want to keep in mind. So edit and revise compulsively. So these are some of the basic outlines of beginning to write. Okay. Belcher also tells us why articles get rejected. So I'll quickly, draw out the reasons why very often articles are rejected. They may be too narrow or too broad, lacking a core argument. Sometimes a researcher can be so very, into his or her project, so very overwhelmed with the task he has at hand, that there is a chance that they miss out on the broader outlook. And yet sometimes the researcher is so broad, so generalized, generic in amassing data that she again loses focus on the core argument. Both are devastating for a research article. Both should be avoided. Don't be too narrow, too broad. That balance is critical. Off topic for the journal. This is one of the most common reasons why journal articles in reputed presses get rejected, because the topic does not fit the journal, right? They may have certain orientations, they may have certain requirements. That's why the model article is important. That's why some research on the journal you're submitting to is of core importance. Not scholarly, so it can be reductive. It may be stating the obvious. It may state something which is very basic. Sloppy means extra and stupid information, which is often not required. By stupid, I mean something which is very, very basic. It's not at all required. Poor referencing. You have put in a lot of material, but without evidence, without showing that you have done, research or got evidence enough. You've simply presented whatever data is at hand or whatever ideas you have. So these count as not scholarly enough. Too defensive, when you're too scared to present your own voice. You insist too much on others' works, use of quotes, use of jargon, as though you're afraid that if your own voice comes out, it's not scholarly enough. This happens with beginning researchers, but very often can linger on to advanced scholars also. Right. So these are very balancing, tricky, aspects of research writing, which one needs to be very careful about. Not original enough. So you probably read, and here any researcher would be that you probably read a number of articles, and your own idea has somewhere been lost, right? You're too dependent on what you have read, and what happens is that your idea is not original enough. So while you're in that Burkean parlor, which I began with, right? While you need to be aware of the discussion which is existing there, you also need to be aware of your own voice to be heard. Remember, Kenneth Burke in the Burkean Parlor actually mentioned that while the discussion is on, your own voice has to also be heard. Your own has to be put in, right? You need to talk. So that balancing is very, very critical for an article to not get rejected. Poor structure. So very often, and this I have seen in a number of scientific articles, especially, which I get requests for editing very often from a number of people given where I work. So what happens is, while there is nuanced and enormous amount of technical data and research, the structuring is often not carefully thought out. Okay, so how do you introduce your topic? How do you sustain your argument? How do you move forward? That is what my second part of today's talk will have. But remember that a poor structure is a sure shot no, is a sure shot rejection. Okay. Theoretically and methodologically flawed, lacking evidence. So this is very understandable, self-explanatory, that anything which has a flaw in the interpretation of theory, in the use of methodology, in the analysis of data. These are typically, the kind of mistakes that happen in research papers. And when one is lacking evidence, again, you've made tall claims, but you don't have enough evidence to back up your claims. So again, one of the major reasons why articles get rejected. Bad writing, too many grammatical and typographic errors. Now, this, like I said, happens even to the most advanced of scholars. Even native speakers are vulnerable to making these flaws. So think of countries where English is not their first language, right? We are quite likely, quite susceptible to making such errors, right? So towards the end of my talk, and I'm hoping time permits, I would want to actually show you a lot of examples of such erroneous writing, right? Again, one of the reasons, because an editor cannot edit the entire research article. So they will very often reject if the writing is too bad, okay? So these are some of the very basic, broad reasons why articles get rejected. So then, how do we go about with research writing? As they say, well begun is half done, right? So if you have begun well, it's quite a promising way to see your article to finish, to progress, right? How do you begin writing to publish? Now, I will be moving slowly towards the specifics, right? Always remember that your published research is a means of communication. Whatever research you have done, whether in your reading room, reading your books, making your notes, whether in your laboratory, working on experiments and instruments, right? Whether on the field where you're collecting ethnographic data, whatever research you have done is finally communicating to the world something, right? And communication is not merely conveying an information, but good communication is often socially responsive problem solving, right? Any research that goes on is obviously addressing a given problem at hand, right? It's analyzing, viewing, examining, critiquing, and giving a final solution or a response to a given problem, right? So, good communication, therefore, depends on how you convey your idea to a certain audience, which is where the audience, your readers, the receivers of your information become very important. What happens with research is sometimes we are so engrossed in what we are reading, what we are thinking, what we are making notes with, we forget that the reader may require some kind of an information which we are not giving out to them. So writing in itself is a very complex business. Okay. I'll pause for just a very brief moment and ask Dr. Dwivedi perhaps if all is well. I see a number of red marks in the chat box. Is there anything I need to respond to, Dr. Dwivedi? Or if there is anybody else?
No, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, you go on.
Yeah, I can continue, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That is basically the attendance link and all that is being posted.
Oh, right.
Nothing
Great.
that concerns you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So, all right, then I will move on from here. And so that's, remember that your research is, again, a kind of a means of communication. So, yeah, generating ideas. So how do you start with the whole act of researching, right? Defining the problem and your task. Identify what has to be addressed. In academic publications, it is your fellow professionals and higher academics all across the world who are perhaps your audience, right? So once you've defined what your problem or what is the issue that you want to talk about is at hand, you also need to identify what has to be addressed and who has it to be addressed to. Determine how to address it. For academic publications, you will need a certain sophistication, jargon, formality, focus, and precision, right? So we bring in a lot of material together. It's very different from, say, journalistic writing, blog writing, informal magazine writing, letters, emails, and so on. Academic writing has a very distinct focus. Most journals, book chapter calls, books will actually tell you this is how you write or this is what is expected. They'll in fact tell you how to format your paper from, say, beginning with the beginning, objectives, methods, and so on. I'll come to that shortly. But remember that academic publication always fits into a certain kind of a structure, and that's actually pretty much universal. That's expected out of any researcher who wants to get published in a good place. I will speak more about this later. I just mentioned the name of the book. They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing. It's an excellent book, right? I would strongly recommend most of you to have it with you because this is one of the books that I have found extremely useful. I will be using templates from it, but this would be a very strong recommendation from my side for all of you to possess. All right. Identifying your audiences and purposes. Identify the uses of your communication and the routes that it will travel. It's very important to keep in mind what kind of routes your communication will travel. Okay. So even, for example, if you're writing a book review, okay, for a very prestigious journal, for example, maybe a North American university press journal, remember that it will usually travel to your editor, then maybe a reviewer, right? And the readers finally, if it gets published, will usually be very higher academic people, right? Even if they are graduate students, they will be people who are trained in a certain way to look at research, right? So these routes have to be there in your mind because sloppy writing, generic writing, or any kind of, overestimated, unsubstantiated writing will not fit into the purposes mostly of academic writing. Impact of cooperative, controversial and ethical ideas. Do keep in mind that, sometimes while it may be tempting to bring in controversial ideas into a certain writing, it's always good to have a neutral perspective when you are presenting it, right? So be careful of controversial concepts, which are very often there to deal with. Ethical ideas, which again, you have to have a neutral perspective. You really can't take a very strong side, as it were, but you have to present your ideas. Your writing itself should not come across as something controversial. Cooperative ideas of what is its final outcome, as it were. If you're cooperating with people, if you're trying to present an idea that brings about a gathering of ideas or people, how you present it without hurting sentiments, right? Without disturbing any status quo, but perhaps talking about progress in a certain way, right? So academic writing for publication has to sort of keep in mind some of these very nuanced, very sensitive aspects. Impact of distortion, incompleteness, inaccuracy, or bias. So these can very often be both personal, but they can also be what one acquires from, around them. So one has to be very careful not to bring in any kind of cultural, data-based, any personal ideological distortion, inaccuracy, bias, or incompleteness into the research. Make sure to have reasoned, well-informed, substantiated claims. Evidence is the key. In all disciplines, research means gathering evidence. It's almost like, presenting your case in a court of law, right? Why would the judge want to hear you or let you win a case unless you have given enough evidence? We actually work somewhat like that. In any discipline, for a research article to find its audience, to find credibility, and to be accepted, you require to have substantiated claims, right? So your data, your analysis, your reasoning is very, very crucial. Avoid generic, uninformed, needlessly controversial ideas. Never miss out on referencing, validating, and acknowledging your sources, especially in today's times when, most publications run a paper or a book submission or a chapter through software that sort of, detects any kind of unacknowledged material. Be very careful how you reference your work. These are very often reasons why, editors or reviewers will return the work asking for more referencing, for more acknowledgement of one's claims, right? So it's crucial that they are kept in mind. How do we then, keeping all of this in mind, begin with the whole act of writing, as it were? Now, I'm sure that every person who's hearing me here today has undergone this process, but I would want to run it past all of us once again, right? It only helps to get your thoughts together all over again to, because each paper, each journal article is a new journey in itself, right? So it's worthwhile to sort of, bring these ideas together. So how does the germ of a research article even originate? How do you even begin the whole process, right? One of the first ways, of course, is to brainstorm. Begin by prioritizing. It's usually intuitive, can be from one scholar or a group of scholars or two scholars, depending on how you want to go about it. Primarily intuitive, from what you have learned, what you have read, what you have amassed together, your analysis, your data, your research. You have an intuitive understanding of what the problem is and what you want to talk about. It can be collaborative, like I said, generates numerous perspectives. So at the brainstorming stage, you can go this way or that. There are so many possible perspectives of presenting a certain research topic, a problem, right? You go through all of those perspectives. You lead to evaluation and organization in your mind first. You have a certain, way of organizing your ideas, and then exploring the subject. So Aristotle actually, in rhetoric long back, I'm talking of the classical age, gives us some of the very core ways of approaching a project. Okay, I want to enumerate them because as old as they are, they continue to be very relevant for anybody embarking upon research. Okay, so Aristotle's common topics, okay, of how to, even start writing is to begin by defining a certain concept. Okay, so definition, which is genus or division, right? How do you define your problem? If there's one concept you want to define, you can define it through its various ways: scientific definition, cultural, geographic, right? What are the various possibles in which you can define a problem? at hand, right? How do you divide it? What division, what classification does your problem fit into? Okay. For example, you're doing diabetes research in the state of Tamil Nadu, right? Immediately, the genus, the division, you see the geography, the culture, the food habits, the health sector engagement, these are the kind of things you would start defining, right? So, definition. Comparison. How do you then start reaching out to a particular topic or a problem? How would you want to reach it? Would you want to look at the similarities between diabetic cure and research in Tamil Nadu with Karnataka, right? That would be making a comparative analysis. Difference, how do you see it as a difference between North and South of India? Degree, is it more intense, the kind of healthcare that happens in Tamil Nadu, or is there some lacks, right? So these are the various, pathways of approaching your problem, okay? Relationship, cause, effect, antecedent, consequence, contraries, contradictions. Again, for a same topic, diabetes research in Tamil Nadu, causes, food habits, genetic factors, environmental factors, effect, what are its effects, what is the kind of awareness that is there, what is the healthcare available, antecedent, how was it seen in the past, consequence, how do people deal with it, how will it be seen in the future, contraries, what are the changes people are making, contradictions, are people following certain ideas or not? These would be again ways of approaching a certain topic. And off the top of my head, I just thought of, say, diabetes research in the state of Tamil Nadu. Okay. Circumstance, what are the possible circumstances, impossible circumstances, past fact, future fact, what are the various reasons that make you want to focus on that particular topic that you have at hand? Testimony. So again, do you have any kind of an authority that is giving you the data or giving you information, your research? Testimonials, statistics, maxims, law, precedents, examples, various kind of research material that you can amass in order to move ahead with your research work. Now, amongst all these 5 that I have mentioned, do remember that depending on your own disposition, depending on your own interest in research, you could may pay more focus to one aspect, to another aspect. You may entirely remove one aspect, right? But like Aristotle told us, these are some of the main, pathways into entering a research problem, into starting to define a given research problem. Okay. Constructing arguments. Once you have your research problem and you have in mind what exactly you want to do, this is how you usually go about constructing argument for perhaps a research paper. In your head, have 5 to 7 keywords, right? So these have to be very core and central to your thesis, to your paper, research article. Forming a potential thesis sentence or the main point of view. They say that if you can have a one thesis sentence of about 20 to 25 words for even a book that you're going to write, you have probably understood your work best, right? So many times in the process of research, we are reading and amassing so much material that we are sort of, unsure or sort of directionless. It happens to every researcher. The key is to find that one core aspect of your writing. Okay, so a thesis sentence, if you can write it somewhere, form it in your mind, is always very helpful to tell you that, okay, this is that backbone to which I have to go back. Okay, to my students, when we discuss research writing, I see it as that, it's almost like that central nervous system, as it were. All the nerves, which is your extra material and data, going and joining. But there is one central core idea that runs all through. Your thesis sentence should be something like that. It's that core idea of your paper, of your book, of your chapter that you must return to time and again. Okay, so always be clear about that one main point of view of the thesis sentence. Organizing your ideas in an outline, which is I'm sure all of you do, but make sure that you have a very clear structuring, and which is why, like I said, towards the end of my discussion in a bit, I will come to why and how organizing is important from the reader's perspective, not the writer's perspective. Okay, so. And then, of course, you make copious notes, amass a lot of solid evidence, which is what will go on to make your writing scholarly, okay, sophisticated and scholarly. Structuring and writing. So this is again something I will talk about at length in a short while, but writing needs to be foolproof. Structuring needs to be reader friendly. These are things that one needs to keep in mind. Okay, hereafter then, because that's where I stopped with the previous part of discussion, I'm coming to this second part of my talk today, and where I will actually talk about the structuring of any research paper, research article, or even a book for that matter. If there are any quick questions, of course, I'll take them at the end. If there are any quick, points that anybody wants to bring up right now, I'll pause for a few moments. Please tell me.
If someone has a question, can ask.
Okay, so no worries. I'm assuming that I will have some interesting questions towards the end of it, because you see, research is a project that is a lifelong endeavor. None of us ever know how to master it, right? Till the day we are working, there is something or the other we can keep improving, right? At every stage of life, from the day you embark upon it till the day you engage with it, there's always room and scope for improvement, right? So I'm assuming that, in my this little short discussion where I'm trying to bring forth a couple of points to you, and of course, this is not in its entirety or foolproof, right? I mean, even years of talking about it cannot exhaust the whole, discussion around research writing, right? So I'm trying to kind of put it all together in a span of a couple of hours, perhaps. So if there are questions at the end of it, I'll be very happy to take. But do remember, we are all in the process of, learning and improving, right? Um, that's it. Let's come to the second part of my presentation. And here I kind of draw largely upon a book called They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein. This book has several editions. So the first one came out in the early 2000s and subsequently been published all across. Graff and Birkenstein are a husband and wife couple. They are at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Graff has been on the educational advisory boards of the government in the United States, and they are academics par excellence. Graff is, of course, a name to sort of reckon with. He's one of the doyens of academic writing, reading. He has talked a lot about how the academia functions, right? And this book, I feel, is one of the greatest gifts they could give really to the whole academic culture in the world. So as I said in the beginning too, I mean, it's a very firm recommendation from my end that you could take a look at this book at your whenever you get the chance to. Okay, so I brought quite a few templates from here as I attempt to talk about the structuring of academic writing and papers. Okay, so usual section divisions in academic publications. As I move more and more to the specific, we started largely with what gets published, what is good publication, what gets rejected. Let's move to now, once we know what gets published, let's move to now how to structure that material which can get published, right? So the usual section divisions in academic publications, in almost all articles or essays, and this one learns from school itself, there's the introduction, the body of the essay, and conclusion. Undoubtedly, this is, of course, the core basic structure. And yet, in scientific and technical articles, we very often know that you have to start off with the aims and objectives. You must state the problem, do a literature review, provide the rationale, the methodology, present your data, and analyze your data, and present a neat and firm results and conclusion section, right? In some specific journals or book chapters, they will actually tell you what they require. They'll very outrightly tell you that, these are the kind of divisions that we require. Like I said, your model article, if you've chosen to submit to a given journal, do have a couple of model articles and take a look at them so that you get a very neat idea of what exactly they require. Okay. For academic books, even if you're presenting a book proposal, trying to get a contract from a publisher, make sure to present its aims and scope, what kind of gaps it fills. Make sure to have a proper introduction, chapter outlines, conclusions. All of that go very well when your book proposal is out for peer review. Okay, so these are the kind of things, the generic structure that one has to keep in mind. Now, once that is said, proceeding with data, because you're already so much, into reading or engaged with your data, it's very often one forgets about structuring the argument. Okay, it's very important to remember to structure your argument. Okay, now Graf and Birkenstein, in the book on which I base my templates, talk about this structuring. Okay, sample templates from the say to begin and sustain an analytical or argumentative article. Introduction, how to begin. Now, I have arbitrarily chosen a topic. I am far from being an expert at this, but because it's right now something that we are all dealing with, negotiating with, I decided to pick up a topic at hand. You can fill up the specifics later, those of you who work perhaps more closely with these issues. Okay, so imagine writing an article on COVID vaccines and medications. Okay, that would depend if one is from a scientific field, technical field, medical field, psychiatric field for that matter. If somebody is from the social sciences field, you would probably have a very different approach. If somebody is from the humanities background, you would probably have another approach, right? And yet the templates that Graf and Birkenstein give us sort of fit in very well with almost all kinds of research writing. Okay, so while your research article may have objectives, the methodology, the literature review, analysis, and results section, there is a general structure which is also very often there, right? And that's what my attempt would be here to present to you. So you would want to look at the following templates for that. Possible beginnings or possible introductions may include beginning with a debate. This is a sample beginning of how you can approach the whole idea of COVID vaccines and medication, right? Beginning with a debate. Now, this is a sample. In discussing the prevalence of COVID cases in Maharashtra, XYZ often claims dash. Like I said, for not being a part of the medical, technical, vaccine-oriented field, I'm keeping these as XYZs, generic names, as dashes. But if you're a specialist, you'll be able to fill in these gaps. My attempt here is to sort of bring to you how perhaps you can begin a concept and in various ways, right? Depending on your research. Remember the genus, the various structuring, the Aristotelian concepts that we talked about. So in discussing the prevalence of COVID cases in Maharashtra, XYZ claims dash. In contrast, ABC argue dash. On the other hand, LMN contends dash. Others even maintain dash. My own view is dash. This is evidenced by the fact dash. It proves that dash. Now, all these dashes, of course, would be filled in by your own research, by your own temperament. Have you done ethnographic research? Have you done scientific research? Have you done drug research? Have you done critical analysis of people's psychologies with COVID vaccines and medication? Depending on your different, subject position as a researcher, you could start with perhaps one of this beginning, right? So beginning with a debate. So there is a debate between XYZ, ABC, LNM, and you fit in yourself somewhere in the debate. Remember again the Burkean parlor, right? The discussion is already on. You are fitting in somewhere there. Stating your position, another way to begin, right? So you have probably worked independently or with a group of people, but this is how you state your position instead of starting with a debate. Drawing upon existing data, I gathered that dash. While reading upon the first phase trials of COVID vaccines, I understood dash. Upon examining subsequent data, I further believe dash. At the same time, I also claim dash and dash. So you begin your introduction in various possible ways. You can begin by stating your position. Now, for anybody here who is perhaps from a humanities background, you could use these same templates for talking about a literary text. You could begin with a debate, right? So, for example, XYZ, D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers is a controversial text, right? So, what have various critics talked about it? When you state your own position, you could start with, in my reading of D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, this is what I believe, right? And the third possible beginning, referring to critical sources to start with, again, you may talk about D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, but you talk it by referring plainly to other critical resources and building on them. I'm hoping this sort of becomes clear with the various possible templates to start your argument. Okay. So, what does it look like? A number of scientists have suggested that the COVID virus is dash. It has become common today to state that dash. In their recent work, A and B claim dash, right? So, this is another way of starting your critical essay by referring to other critical sources. Summary of your main argument before you go on to giving your data, your analysis. After the introduction, you require a short summary of what your paper is going to be all about, right? The introduction, however, should give upfront what you want to say. Your thesis statement, your core idea needs to come out clearly. Okay. Following the introduction, a short summary of what perhaps your main argument is all about. So, health research professionals believe that a radical change in dash can lead to, sorry, there's a typo there, can lead to dash. They emphasize dash. Others are of the opinion dash. Accordingly, I reaffirm dash, right? So it would depend again on what direction your research is taking, right? But a summarizing of the main argument with substantial referencing, with substantial evidence, okay? Your main analysis begins after this informed summary in most cases. Body of the article, it can have various subsections depending upon your discipline. Okay. When you disagree with existing ideas and give reasons for it. So, very often in scientific, technical, even social sciences research, you could simply be disagreeing with a given point of view, with given existing literature, given discussion in the Burkean parlor. Right? So you can have various approaches to disagreeing with existing views, the existing data. The scholar A is mistaken about mutations in COVID viruses because she ignores the fact dash and you cite, right? So you disagree with a certain view. I disagree with A's view that dash because recent studies on virus mutations have revealed dash. So again, you are disagreeing with somebody and then you will bring forth your own research. When you agree with existing ideas and continue by adding your own take to the existing idea. Again, the parallels with Burkean parlor, right? I agree with researchers A and B for their views on COVID viruses and mutation because my own research confirms dash. So you're building on existing data, available thesis. Excess theory on COVID vaccines is extremely useful because it sheds light on dash. This helps me understand dash. So you have agreed with existing research. Okay. When you simultaneously agree and disagree, that also is very often the case in academic research. Though I concede dash, I still insist phase 3 trials of COVID vaccines lead to dash, right? So you agree and you disagree simultaneously. While researchers A and B are entirely certain when they state dash, they are also right when they claim dash, right? So you may agree with something, you may slightly disagree something, but you can put all of them together. So that's how you proceed, the various ways of proceeding with an academic argument. Remaining undecided, I am on two minds about the emerging theories on COVID vaccines. On the one hand, I agree dash. On the other hand, I am not sure whether dash, right? So these are again various techniques that Graf and Birkenstein tell us how to present your own take. Because at many stages in research, we don't have a final conclusive answer to what is going on. And yet it is important to present your research to the world, right? So you can afford to be on two minds, but present the reasons carefully, show your evidences carefully. My take on COVID medication is currently ambiguous. I do not support scientists like X and Y for dash, but I find the research on dash and the issues that they mention equally justifiable, right? So this is again being undecided. Okay. Towards a conclusion, of course, in all of this, the various templates I gave you belong to both the methodology section, not just both, but all of the methodology section, literature review section, data analysis, data presentation, right? So the various approaches you can take to presenting your material, right? If it is a humanities research, again, you may take a certain direction, okay? But you may refer to existing data, you may build upon it, you may reject it, you may digress from it. So the various possible permutation combinations have been presented very clearly by Graf and Birkenstein in the templates that I sort of draw upon. Okay. Finally, towards the conclusion, use transitions. Usually, towards the conclusion, when you have these transition phrases, it helps your reader to understand that you're moving finally towards giving your conclusion, right? So as a result, after all, in short, finally, to summarize in some, simply put, some of the possible phrases that sort of, goad your reader to believe that, okay, now you're moving towards the conclusive parts. Of course, in technical papers, you usually have the section title, results, and conclusion. Even there, these phrases are usually helpful. Concluding sections, just repeat yourself, but be slightly different this time because you had started off with the introduction, introducing your theme, your problem at hand. When you're concluding, how do you repeat yourself? In sum, my argument is dash. So you have to repeat, but this exactly, based on all the data, all the evidence you presented, this is my argument. To conclude, my findings affirm that COVID vaccines are dash, and what A and B claim as dash is for dash. So that's your final concluding statement. By analysis of data on patient recovery, we understand that COVID medication can be dash, and I believe this may lead to dash, right? So again, one of the possible final concluding statements, right? So I'm hoping that, this whole movement from introduction towards presenting your own position towards moving towards a final summarizing and then concluding your argument in a research paper sort of makes sense at this stage. Okay, so this is kind of, it gives an outline of how structuring can happen. Okay, this brings me finally to the last bit of my presentation, the third and final part of my presentation, where I'll talk more about the writing errors that happen. Okay, so what gets published, what gets rejected, how to structure your publishable prose, and finally, what are the final details of publishable prose that add to sound structuring, especially for non-native English users. Okay, for those of you for whom things like active voice, passive voice, nominals may seem redundant, I urge you to look at them all over again because, as non native users of English, very often these mistakes come up even in advanced forms of writing. Okay, so I will talk about some of the more finer details of publishable prose. Okay. I will again pause for just a couple of seconds, and if there are any quick questions at this stage, I would be very happy to address them.
Yeah, ma'am. Thanks for the nice illustrations, madam. You talked about conclusion section.
Right.
It can be in the form of a paragraph as well, right? Wherein I summarize some of the key results and then conclude in the final sentence, right?
Yes, of course. Because you see, each journal, each book chapter will have their own pattern. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is it need not be this one sentence at all. It's usually a whole paragraph, but you begin like this in the concluding section. Okay. So the dashes that I have, it follows a longer assessment of what has gone on.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
Right.
And also, if possible, please share the PPT, madam. It's of very great use. Thank you.
I'll be very happy to. In fact, I will give a reading list, which is even more of use. So I'll talk to Professor Trivedi and get in touch.
Right. Nice.
Thank you. Anything else that anybody quickly has at this stage, or else I'll move on?
May I? Ma'am, I just want to ask when, we are writing, especially in the academia, we're writing number of papers. And these are obviously the templates which you've given us sort of for an idea. But if you've written more than 5-10 papers and, if you're using the same kind of language, you feel, you're repeating the structure. So is it somewhere possible, especially when you're from... I'm from mass communication, so it feels as if I am just filling up these dashes in every paper. So can we have variety in the language, or this should be the set of standard for a research paper only?
Not at all. I mean, thank you for that question. And this is actually, which is why I said that, more than sharing the PPT, as I think the person who asked the question before you said, it would help to read Graf's and Birkenstein's book, because they give you these as just a few samples. Okay, there are endless such samples that you can create. And of course, one should not be repetitive. These are some of the ways of approaching. Each new paper would have a new discussion at hand, a new problem at hand, right? I keep repeating that these are some of the possible approaches. As you keep moving, you will develop your own templates, right? Very often, what happens is that we are unaware even of how to go about creating a certain argument. Okay, so my attempt here is not at all to endorse these templates as the final possible templates only, not at all. And Graf and Bergenstein, in fact, very clearly tell us that, it's just to maybe mold our minds in a certain way. If I may say so, maybe when somebody is learning, say, the game of cricket, their father or brother or a coach probably teaches them this is how you ball and bat, right? Or this is how you keep the wicket or, get a catch and so on. But as the child grows up, and if it's a professional cricketer, they develop their own style, right? So probably these templates we could look at it as something that we can use just when we are, starting the whole project of research, but you can build on them, build your own style. Okay, so these are not foolproof by any means or the final answer by any means. Please build on them. These are suggested sample possible templates, right? The importance then of these templates is that very often people miss out even on this clear structuring, right? So one needs to understand the structuring in order to build further. Right. So please look at the books that I will suggest also as means of stepping stones. They are not the final foolproof, Each of us develop our own styles, as I believe all of you have and will be developing as you keep writing, right? So please look at it in that way. This is not the final foolproof thing, if I may just repeat myself. Have I answered the question?
Yes, definitely, ma'am. Thank you.
Most welcome. Anybody else who wants a quick...
Ma'am, Chandra again.
Yes.
When we are writing the complete thesis, it is something like extension of whatever the ideas that you are proposing, right?
Extension of ideas that I am proposing. Okay, let me hear this.
You're presenting. If I am writing the complete thesis in place of a review article, so the same ideas I will be elaborating in a wider manner, right?
You would be elaborating, but it will depend on how many sections you have, because just a review article would probably have only literature review, and it would talk about what gaps are there in that literature review or what can be added to it, right? But if you're writing a full-length article, you would require to flesh it out in far greater ways as to what your own take on the whole issue is. Where are you departing? What are the different things that you are adding to a particular topic? So it would definitely be fleshed out a lot more than just a review article.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. And can you suggest some tips to avoid plagiarism, which is also the need of the hour?
Well, simply acknowledge sources and don't rely too much on sources is what I would say, right? Every word that you have picked up from a third party source, and there is a lot which in scholarly writing you have to use, extra material evidence and scholarly resources. Make sure to be very much foolproof in your referencing and your citation. Okay. Also, don't rely too much on the borrowed material. Try to build your own voice, which is informed by the borrowed material. Okay, so it's always, it's almost like in, I don't know if you cook, but like we probably learn to cook maybe from our older mothers or grandmothers or even fathers in some cases, but we always give it our own touch, right? When we try to prepare a dish. So it's the same for writing. Your own touch you may be informed by everything that's around you, but your own output has to be your own. It has to have your own touch to it, right? Your own style, your own understanding to it. So yes. I would say that, be a compulsive, editor, reference, cite, and don't forget the importance of your own voice. Even if you're reading hundreds of things, your own voice should not get drowned in all of that.
Thank you. Thank you for your clear explanation. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Okay, so I shall move on. And if there are more such very interesting questions, I'll be very happy to take them up towards the end. Okay, so this last bit of my presentation, it's more about, publishable prose and what, kind of mistakes that we make. So I have here quickly, I will read through two samples of very complex academic writing. Okay, one is by a cultural theorist, Homi Bhabha. Okay, he talks about, he's a post-colonial theorist located in the West, and he talks about issues of culture, of post-colonial identity, and so on. He's considered to be one of the most complex writers. Let me quickly read it with you. If for a while the ruse of desire is calculable for the uses of discipline, soon the repetition of guilt, justification, pseudoscientific theories, superstitions, spurious authorities, and classifications can be seen as the desperate effort to normalize formally the disturbance of a discourse of splitting that violates the rational, enlightened claims of its enunciatory modality. Now, Bhabha is known for his complexities. Okay, while he talks of issues of identity, culture, of post-colonial politics, and so on, he is known for writing in a very jargon-oriented, in a very abstract, obtuse manner, and as much as a scholar par excellence as he is, these have been seen as some of the impediments to people who want to reach out to Bhabha's works. And you really have to train yourself to read and understand the very sophisticated nuances. That's an example of cultural or literary sort of writing. I have a scientific example again. This is also complex, but that's because it uses jargon, right? There is considerable evidence that hyperglycemia can adversely affect many biochemical pathways, including glucose oxidation, the formation of advanced glycation and end products, AGE, and activation of polyol pathways, all of which are associated with the generation of ROS, ultimately leading to increased oxidative stress in variety of tissues. But it is not clear how hyperglycemia causes oxidative stress. Furthermore, besides hyperglycemia, hyperlipidemia, and hypertension, inflammation factors, and dyshomeostasis of trace elements also increase the generation of various ROS and RNS, and this is page 1 to 3. Now, the first was from the book called The Location of Culture, 1994. The second is a proceedings of a conference which was held in, I think, 2007. Okay, both one is a cultural discourse, the other a scientific, heavily jargony, heavily academic, and extremely sophisticated in their approach, but not meant for a generalist audience. Okay, now while we may be required to write in these manners at times as we function through our given vocation, the choice to be simple is always there, right? So, and I'm not being by simple, I don't want you to be reductive. Don't make it a dumbed down idea, but your presentation can always just stick to facts. Of course, in cases you may require to put proper nouns, especially in scientific and technical articles, right? So, for example, hyperglycemia cannot be called anything else, right? So you have to stick to it. And yet the explication part, depending on which journal you're publishing, you may require to alter, okay? So what happens is that sometimes the kind of mistakes we make, and we call this writerly writing. What do I mean by that? When the writer is so self-absorbed that we write for ourselves, that is writerly writing. Okay, so there would be often incorrect sentences, common mistakes among non-native speakers. So because we are not bothered about the pathways our writing will travel, how will people appropriate it, what will they gain out of it? Okay, so writerly writing, and I have some examples. This is an example. Being the most spectacular event in the nation, newspapers were obligated to devote major coverage to the hurricane. Okay. Now let's read it again. Being the most spectacular event in the nation, newspapers were obligated to devote major coverage to the hurricane. Now, this is actually from an American newspaper, and it's considered a very reputed newspaper, but now, the error that can come in, because it's written from the writer's perspective, newspapers were not the most spectacular event, the hurricane was, right? But when you read it again, you will see that there is a chance you will misinterpret newspapers as the most spectacular event, okay? Being the most spectacular event in the nation, the newspapers were obligated. Now, the way the sentence is structured, the modifier or the syntax, the way the words are put, sometimes the meaning is lost, right? Instead of hurricane, there's a chance that somebody can imagine that the newspapers were the most spectacular event, okay? These are typically the mistakes that non-native speakers of English make. The other would be, again, the subject-verb disagreement, right? Tenses disagreement. He had arrived at his hometown. He had arrived at his hometown, right? So these are very simple errors, and which perhaps many of you are aware of, and yet it keeps coming up time and again, is what I have seen. Either the physicians in this hospital or the chief administrator are going to make a decision. Again, the subject word administrator, going to make a decision. Here it would be is, right? So the sort of subject and the verb, right? what should be the whole connection. If it's plural, it has to be plural. If it's singular, it has to be singular, right? So this kind of placing of words, of grammar errors, they are also a part of the writerly mistakes we make. Not just the previous one that we had seen, the complex kind of writing, but also the errors that we have. So I have a couple of more examples of clumsy writing. Always try to use active voice. While all of you must be aware of this, I'll give you a few examples, right, to make this more appropriate. Cows eat grass, grass is eaten by cows. Always try to make your sentences more crisp, more precise. You don't need extra words ever. The more extra words there are, the more chances of mistake. Okay. So, of course, use what is important to convey your information, to communicate, but make sure not to have unnecessary words. That becomes writerly writing. You're writing for yourself, you're making a note for yourself. But when you're writing for an audience, when you're writing to publish, right, that's what the topic of my presentation today is. When you're writing to publish, write for your reader, don't write for yourself. Okay, so get into the reader's shoes, try to understand what they need, and try and write like that. Use the same tense throughout. Simple present is preferred, is understood and not could be understood, right? So mostly the simple present kind of makes your tone very quick and crisp and fast. Use action verbs always, right? Instead of saying he got a promotion, he achieved a raise, right? So when you say achieved, it shows that some work has gone into it. The more action verbs you use, okay, the more powerful your prose becomes. Okay, he was diagnosed with, say, liver failure. He got the dose, he was administered the dose. He looked at the papers, he examined the papers. When you say look, the whole verb is a lighter, it's not an action verb. But when you say examine, it's a more powerful verb, right? So have your list of action verbs. Your scholarly and academic writing gains a lot by use of action verbs. Okay, the verbs which talk about action: examine, inspected, attained, chaired, conceived, researched, right, convinced, demonstrated, argued. These are all action verbs. Instead of he says so, you could say he states so, right? So there's an emphasis on the action that makes writing also faster. Okay, so these are some of the means that need to be kept in mind. Verbose and complicated sentences. Now look at this. All articles that coruscate with resplendence are not truly auriferous. Simply means all that glitters is not gold, right? So very often we are so sold out to big words, huge vocabulary that we may have developed, we needlessly go into making complicated meandering sentences. Avoid them at all costs. Don't give up the jargon or the sophistication of your discipline, of your chosen discipline, but make sure to write very crisp, precise, to the point sentences. Members of an avian species of identical plumage congregate. Birds of a feather flock together, right? So these are like almost funny to see how we can sometimes get into these meandering, complicated sentences, verbose sentences. He was trying to describe the nature of things as clearly as he could. He was trying to describe things precisely. Nature of things clearly, as clearly as he could. When you say things, obviously the nature is understood. You don't need to say nature of things. When you go for very highly reputed international journals, writing like this can actually face rejection. Okay, so remembering the nature of things is not required. When you just say simply things, that's precise enough, that's good enough. Okay, so this will come with practice, like any sport, like any other craft that you may have developed in life, whether it's a game, it's cooking, whether it's sewing, whether it's any singing, dancing, driving, any of these. As they become better with practice, so is with writing, right? The more we read and write, the better we become with them. So reading also reputed journals is a very important activity that we should also engage in, right? So avoid phrases such as nature of, manner of, was like, and others to gain clarity and precision. We speak in this manner today. I was like going there. I was going there. You don't need the was like. His manner of talking. He talked in a certain way. His manner of talking was aggressive. He talked aggressively. That's good enough. right? So we don't need these redundant, verbose, complicated phrases in our writing. Generally, remember, always avoid the repetition of a word or a phrase or an idea in the same sentence or paragraph. Put yourself in your reader's shoes. Would you want to read something which keeps repeating itself? Right? You can't keep repeating a certain thing time and again. You don't want to read it. Neither will your reader. So always be mindful of what the reader may want to understand or read. Okay. Use connecting words between sentences and paragraphs, especially introduction and ensuing paragraphs for smooth transition of ideas. So from one paragraph to the next as you keep moving. Suppose the first paragraph has said something and you want to argue against it. Start your paragraph with arguably, the data presented by XYZ does not work, and I am going to say this. But when you begin with a word like arguably, your reader automatically knows that you're taking them towards an argument significantly. Again, when you begin a sentence with that, perhaps your reader knows that you're giving something of importance. Moreover, so you're about to add something. Understandably, when you're going to add something which already exists. Likewise, similarly, when you're talking of similar things, notably, finally, and so many more. So remember to use these transitions between sentences and paragraphs, right? They will only make the flow of your writing more and more smooth, okay? Avoid these informalities, the kind of symbols for and, etc, eg. Instead, write and, write among others, and more. These are more formal instead of writing these shorthand kind of things of etc, eg. They are not very much accepted or asked or appreciated by internationally reputed publishers. Okay. Also, use of ellipses, use of commas and full stops. Be very careful. Okay. Be careful of the case. That is, always have I've seen this in a number of even advanced research articles that come to me for editing sometimes, that, even proper nouns with small case, starting with a small letter. Try to avoid these mistakes because they immediately give your reviewer or editor the sense that it's clumsy writing. Okay. So edit compulsively. Edit. If you have edited thrice, edit it the fourth time. If required, sleep over your article for a night. Next morning, get up and edit again. But make sure to, be foolproof as far as you can. Punctuations, read up more about how to use comma. I will not go into too much detail because even these punctuations also have an entire history of their own. The books that I will be giving you for the reading list have enough material that should be of use in finding out about punctuations and how to use them best. Okay. So these are again some of the important things to be kept in mind. So finally, what is the kind of writing that as researchers, as publishers, we should think about? It is not writerly writing, but readerly writing. Writing that your readers can appreciate. What is it? It is not dumbing down. You don't have to become stupid or lose sophistication or data to make it simple. Okay. But you have to be clear and forthright. So while it is simple, it sticks to rules of grammar. It is chronological. It does not go crazy. You can go back and forth in time when you're doing creative writing. Okay. But largely, most academic prose is chronological. It follows a certain structure and order. You have to develop your argument in a certain order. Okay. So remember that chronology. Write without contradictions. And if you have to talk about contradictions, put them in such a way that they also form a part of that scholarly debate. Okay. So I talked about you how to agree and disagree, right? So you start by saying that while I agree with these claims, these are the parts where I would want to disagree, right? So when there are contradiction, even those should be put inside a scholarly academic discourse. Okay. That is readerly writing. It should not come out as a fanciful, as a wishful, activity from your part, as something that you're not, just you're dismissing. That should not be the idea. Without complexity. Even the most complex of ideas can be presented with a lot of clarity. Don't make it unnecessarily complex. Okay. First have a very clear understanding of your own perceptions of a particular topic, and then it would automatically come out without complexity. Be mindful of avoid wordiness and unnecessary details. Gain the right emphasis in your sentences, which is very important. How to make writing clear and focused. Okay, so these are some of the examples. And because a particular journal essay is made of several paragraphs, paragraphs are made of sentences and sentences of words. I will give you a few examples of how to, again, get rid of this excessive wordiness, on how to emphasize on the right things in your sentences. Okay, so nominals. Nominals are nouns which are created by adding suffixes to verbs. For example, verb would be to establish, establishment, it becomes a noun. Okay. Complete is the verb, completion, it would become a noun. Deliver and deliverance. Every time you make it a nominal, right, your sentence will automatically become longer. Okay. Some examples, try and avoid these. Stick to action verbs. Do not add suffixes such as ment, anc, ity, izd, ness. These are some of the typical, nominals that we end up using, and our sentences become long and complicated. Strict enforcement of the speed limit by the police will cause a reduction in traffic fatalities. Revised. If the police strictly enforce the speed limit, traffic fatalities will be reduced. Enforcement, enforce, right? Reduction, reduced. Avoid tion, ment, these kind of nominals. Okay, I'm hoping that there are endless examples, but I just want to quickly present some of these to you. Weak verbs, the moment you use weak verbs, your automatically the sentences will become longer. So weak verbs are verbs like make, give, take. They can occur in combination with nominals as replacements for stronger, more energetic verbs that have been changed into nouns. Look at the example. The next day, the town council will take the firefighters' request for a raise under consideration. Long sentence. The next day, the town council will consider the firefighters' request for a raise. Consideration, consider, right? Remember to remove and the moment you remove the weak verb take, right, automatically the sentence is shorter, it is more crisp, it is more precise, right? So try to stick to action verbs, try to avoid nominals. Roundabout constructions, quickly, words such as angle, aspect, factor, situation, and phrases such as in the case of, in the line of, in the field of are almost never necessary and are common obstacles to directness. So when you're trying to create direct prose, they just make it more wordy. Another aspect of the situation that needs to be examined is the matter of advertising. We should also examine advertising. Another aspect of the situation that needs to be examined long. We should simply examine advertising, right? So this is how we, these long phrases are absolutely redundant. We talk like that, so we end up writing like that, especially non-native speakers. So be mindful of this, okay? Unnecessary phrases and clauses, and I'll quickly come to the examples. This t-shirt, which is made of wool, has worn well for 8 years. This woolen shirt has worn well for 8 years. There are a lot of unnecessary clauses that we try to introduce, unnecessary phrases. We can always do away with them to make them less wordy, less complicated. Okay. Awkward repetition. Like I said, don't repeat the same idea in a sentence, in a paragraph, in a paper time and again. You may need to repeat, but repeat it differently. Okay. Don't repeat the same sentence, same idea time and again. Repeat it with new evidence, new methods, right? New techniques. That's how you would need to repeat it. Gas mileage of American cars is being improved constantly in order to improve efficiency. Revised. Gas mileage of American cars is being improved constantly to increase efficiency. Now, if you look at the previous sentence, improved appears twice, right? That makes it an awkward sentence. When you write it simply as once and you shorten it, it becomes a far more crisp and clear sentence, okay? So try to avoid repetition, awkward repetition. Intensives and other modifiers. So be careful of intensives like very and much. They weaken your sentence. I certainly was very much pleased when they told me they were so much interested. I was very pleased when they told me they were interested. The same idea, the same emphasis. You don't need the very and the much. They are two superlatives and comparatives at the same time. Okay. So we don't need to use them. Okay, so try to be crisp, remove these excesses always. Always revise your sentences. Okay, as you compulsively revise, even when you have read it, give it a break, come back and revise your sentence again. Keep in mind the following: every sentence is a part of a paragraph and of a larger whole. To determine what to emphasize, always look at the sentence in relation to its context and in relation to your audience and the overall purpose of your writing. Okay, so always remember the thesis sentence I talked about. Every time you have finished writing something, go back and see if your thesis sentence is coming true in your larger write up. Have you lost it somewhere? Very often this happens, even with very seasoned published researchers. When you read their papers which have come for review, they may have lost the core argument while writing a longer thesis, like while writing a longer paper or a book or a chapter, right? So always make sure that your larger purpose is taken care of, your audiences are having a clear understanding of what you want to say. Word order. The position of words in a sentence is the principal means of showing the relationship in a sentence. The writer must therefore bring together words and groups of words that are related in thought and keep apart those that are not related. Thus, word order is crucial to meaning in English. Subject, verb, object relations need to be clear. There's a typo, I'm sorry, so they need to be clear. Unless writers are alert, sentences such as these can come up. He noticed a large stain in the rug that was right in the center. Now, this is a confusing sentence because you don't know whether the rug is in the center or the stain is in the center. Okay, so the revised one would be: he noticed a large stain right in the center of the rug, right? So here the center is about the rug and not the room where probably the rug is. Okay. In writing, place adverbs such as almost, even, hardly, just, only, nearly immediately before the words they modify. Okay. Examples: in speech, we commonly put only and similar adverbs before the verbs, regardless of what we mean them to modify. To avoid any possible ambiguity in writing, place such modifiers immediately before the words they modify. Now, these are some basic rules of grammar that we all pick up in school and forget as we keep writing. Okay, basic grammar books, again, the reading list I will be passing on to you will actually give you a good idea of following these grammar rules. Do keep them in mind. So when you speak, you say he only ran a mile. He ran only a mile when you write, because you're talking, the only is about the mile, not about him or his running, right? He may have walked some part also. So he ran only a mile, not he only ran a mile. Okay. So when speaking, you can probably have gestures or, tone to show what you're saying. When writing, you have to be more and more precise. Okay. So adverbs, therefore, have to be placed very carefully. Avoid squinting modifiers. Squinting, that is, sentences which say one thing and mean another. Quickly, I'll come to the example. His physician told him frequently to exercise. Now, we don't know here whether the physician is telling him frequently or whether he's being asked to exercise frequently, right? So the correct sentence would be: his physician frequently told him to exercise. Both sentences are grammatically correct, but when you write it in a scholarly article, because the meaning in the first case can be of two types, it does not get accepted by your reviewers or readers. That is why precision. Okay, what exactly do you want to say needs to come out with clarity. So how you place words in your sentences are of crucial importance. Okay, this also is clear. His physician told him to exercise frequently. Okay, so these are some of, again, the very important things. If you have to pack two or more ideas in a sentence, make it a balanced one. So I'll have an example. We always like those who admire us. We do not always like those whom we admire. We are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. This is Martin Luther Jr. Now, if you're making a compound complex sentence, divide it by a semicolon or a colon and see to it that two parts of a complex sentence are talking to each other. They are joined to each other. Okay. The more you read up such sentences, the more finesse you will get in using them. Okay, my showing you hundreds of examples perhaps won't really help. So the more you read such sentences, as you read more of journal articles, it'll automatically become clearer and clearer. The balanced sentence is useful for stating contrasts and distinctions because it holds two coordinate ideas before the reader. Its structure naturally emphasizes meanings involving weighing or choice. So, a sentence which is heavy and complex has two parts but must talk to each other. Okay. Active or passive voice, especially non native speakers, often make a mistake with this. So, I will come quickly to some of the examples. You can use the passive voice. It's ideally avoidable, but you can sometimes use it, right? When the object or receiver is more important than the doer. These are the cases in which you can use the passive. The doer of the action is not known. The writer wishes to place the emphasis on the receiver and not on the doer. Okay. Some examples of possible passive voice sentences. Several priceless manuscripts were destroyed. The wounded prisoner was dragged into the trench. We don't know who the doers are in these cases. But notice the difference in the following sentences when the active replaces the passive. Weak, other games are also played by the guests. The guests also play other games. It's more quick, it is active, it is fast. So you can use the passive only in cases where the doer is not known, right? When the receiver is more important, in those cases you can use the passive or else stick to the active voice always. Week, many agonizing minutes are spent by the student in deciding on a subject for a speech. The student spends many agonizing minutes deciding upon a subject for a speech, right? So active is always better. Clarity, ambiguity is an ambiguous sentence in which one logically can have two meanings. So I gave you substantial examples of the possible ambiguous sentences, right? Mr. Flack told his brother that he must pay the bill. Now, who is he here? Should he pay or should his brother pay? Right? So these are ambiguous sentences. I've put in a lot of examples of this just for you to be mindful of these possible mistakes, right? Jargon, again, something that we should ideally avoid, right? And yet in some subjects, in some discourses, it is important. The answer is in the negative is jargony. Instead of no, the writer of jargon would say the answer is in negative. Government pamphlets and letters and reports of economists and engineers could often be improved by the omission of jargon. So here again is a jargony sentence. The hardcore of United States farm problem is the surplus of human effort committed to farming. Revise, there are too many farmers. Okay, so these jargony sentences again make you lose focus. There are too many words, they become awkward. Okay. At all costs, avoid artificial and overblown writing. In an effort to be highly regarded, the writer loads his or her style with too many adjectives and adverbs, with big words, awkward repetitions, high-sounding phrases, and cliched figures of speech. It often results in overcomplicated sentences, which is what should be, they become showy and stuffy and hence should be avoided. Okay, so overblown sentences, examples, yeah, precise sentences, again an example. After liquidating his indebtedness, he was still in possession of sufficient funds to establish a small commercial enterprise. Precise, after paying his debts, he still had enough money to set up a small business, right? So don't use overblown, very heavily worded sentences. Simple, we decided against it. Complicated or pompous, we have assumed a negative posture on the matter. Long, right? So we don't need such sentences. And finally, this is my concluding slide actually. All good writing is rewriting. I cannot emphasize this more. Edit compulsively. Okay. First write, then rewrite. Again, come back after a day, rewrite again. Okay. Truman Capote, a very famous American novelist and a journalist, tells us this, and I firmly stand by it, that good writing is always rewriting. Okay. So even as you draw upon the various ideas that I have presented to you today, and I'm hoping they are all useful to you, remember to be a compulsive editor, a compulsive, reviser of your own prose. You have to keep going back and rereading, re-editing till you think it is foolproof. Okay. I would just want to conclude by saying that, many of the things that I've tried my best to pack into this close to 2 hour session are not the final or the foolproof answers to the techniques of research writing. They are just some of the pointers, and I would strongly urge that you develop on them. Okay. Develop your own style. These are some of the possible pathways, but following these pathways, I'm sure you'll discover your own very strong positions of being able to write well. Okay. This is my reading list, which I'll come to. So, simple, direct, clear, well-informed prose is the hallmark of work that gets published by world's reputed presses. And so, be a compulsive editor of your own writing, right? Always rewrite, always make sure to edit. Okay. This is a brief bibliography. This is the reading list that I shall be passing on to you, which is what I drew upon for, using my own presentation today. Some of the books are of enormous help. Okay. So, do try and take a look at these. The examples I gave you are all drawn from these books, so you will find many more in these books if you happen to go through them. Okay. So I shall call it a day from my side, and thank you all for being such a patient audience on a Sunday evening. If there are some more questions, I'll be very happy to attend to them.
Thank you, ma'am. It was really interesting talk. Very interesting.
Thank you so much.
Really,
I appreciate
very useful.
Glad to hear that. Any questions from the participants that I might be able to respond to? I'll be happy to take up.
Hello, ma'am. This
Yes.
is Manivendra.
Huh.
Ma'am, actually, I need to ask you about a question, a small query. Actually, I need to know that is there a standard proportion to illustrate evidence and with our own opinions, especially for a researcher who is in his beginning phase?
Could you define that proportion to me a little better? What do you mean?
Yes, ma'am. As in, actually, when we attempt to write a research paper, we have to provide substantial evidences, as you mentioned already. So, what I need to know that is, do we need to follow a standard proportion for that, or we can rely on our own opinions and time and again hark upon the evidences that we have collected for our paper?
Okay. That's again a very relevant question, and I can imagine, because you said that you're at a starting stage, but even advanced researchers face this problem. So what I will say is, if you the key is to zero down upon a journal perhaps where you would want to send your paper, and look at a few sample papers, okay, model papers, which is what I said. You will get an idea that every journal has a certain tenor, it has a certain tone. So some may want a very general introduction to a concept, okay, and expect you to sort of write on those lines. But almost all journals will require you to substantiate. So as you present your own take, try your best to also substantiate. Now, how much of evidence is required will vary from journal to journal. So some journals may require a more colloquial approach, right? They may require a more generalist approach. Some may be very technically specific. That's why a model article is always good to read. Not just one, maybe 2 or 3. Read it very carefully and see what their published article looks like. Okay. From your side, as a beginning researcher, sometimes you might be very keen on, presenting everything that you know. How do you go about balancing that? Right. So again, that balancing you would get to know from, reading a model article, a sample article, that this is the amount that they require. Remember always that, you are submitting to them and it's up to them to refuse or accept your paper. Right. So you have to be mindful of what their requirements are and accordingly, chip in whatever you have to say. Have I answered your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Great.
Ma'am, a question.
Yes.
In scientific articles, science articles especially, can we begin, because in one of the slides you showed beginning of a sentence with if. But in science article, can we start with if in any of the sentences?
Well, beginning with if is perhaps slightly more creative. So, like the book from which I would have drawn the templates are largely, more of the humanities, social sciences kind of thing. If it's not acceptable, don't. But if you have something which is substantial and you can actually start with an if, say you're talking about a hypothesis, right? And if would very often be useful when you're talking about a possible hypothesis, right? If we imagine this, then probably this can be the outcome. Maybe there you can take that liberty. If is also slightly an informal way of beginning. So again, like I said, research your journal very well. If it accepts articles which have a slightly conversational, slightly informal tone, if the published articles accept that. For example, Nature and Science sometimes would have very beautiful prose, really. Apart from scientific data, some of the articles are so readable, right? For non specialists, we sometimes really enjoy reading those articles simply because the way they present it, right? So if you find that your target journal is accepting informal conversational speech, by all means go ahead. But if you see that most of them are very rigid, formal, structured sentences, I would suggest do not experiment. Okay, so I can't have one answer, it's case to case actually.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, understood. And one more thing is that generally in science articles, there is an argument, and many say that we have to go for third person rather than first. So, is it in science articles, because we are proposing an idea or a fact, so it should be in a third person? That is what many say.
That's perfectly agreeable. I mean, while active voice and first person or even second is doable, I would suggest that always stick to the journal's guidelines. Okay, don't experiment around with that, because they have certain, structures or certain requirements for a purpose, and you should not go experimenting with that. So I would suggest, if it's a requirement, if it's in the style guide, very carefully scan this journal style guide always. Okay, so that gives you a good idea of what exactly they want, and the sample model article is always very important. Something may be close to the area you're working in, which is why you would have chosen the journal. So pick up those and perhaps look at it.
Okay. Because in experiment, instead of saying that we conducted, it is they say that many
Was
say
conducted.
Experiment was conducted something, and also past tense will be mostly expected in science articles, especially.
That's perfectly agreeable. That's perfectly agreeable. I mean, if that is the tendency, you're most welcome to write like that. Again, some science articles would actually encourage conversational speech. So in those, you're most welcome to do it differently. I mean, there's no one rule for this. Okay, stick to the requirements of your discipline and a journal. That's what I would say here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other question? Okay, if no questions, I would request Ms. Kashyapi Ghosh to